morning, everyone. My name is Fenella France. I'm Chief of the Preservation Research and Testing Division. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you here today to one of our Topics in Preservation series presentations. The Library of Congress holds the manuscript map of the Dartmoor River region, and we would like to take a moment to thank our colleagues in Geography and Maps who have been so generous with their expertise, knowledge, and access to the collection. This unique map depicts a remote gold mining frontier in today's Colombia, created in 1764. The map highlights the Dartmoor River, which connected the Spanish colonial town of Cali to the Pacific port of Guanabara. A full historical investigation of the map has allowed the unearthing of stories about African resilience, resistance, adaptation, entrepreneurship, and survival in this periphery of the Spanish Empire. The scientific examination of the map has led to further new information, pulling back the curtain from how this large watercolour map has been assembled using pigments and paper from across the empire. I'd just like to introduce our two speakers before I hand over to them. Juliet Wismar specialises in the visual and material culture of the pre-Hispanic and the late Spanish colonial Andes, Peru and Colombia. She holds a PhD in art history and archaeology from the University of Maryland and an MA from the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University. Juliet's new book, look for that, is entitled The History of a Periphery, Spanish Colonial Cartography from Colombia's Pacific Lowlands. This uses manuscript maps from 18th century New Granada, today's Colombia, to unearth narratives about African autonomy, placemaking, indigenous resistance, and tenuous colonialisms in gold mining areas on the fringes of Spain's empire. Coming from a gold mining town myself, this is very interesting to me, from another country though. Megan Hill is the Preservation Science Specialist in the Preservation Research and Testing Division here at the Library of Congress. She's an expert in spectral image capture and processing methodologies and has worked with numerous cultural heritage institutions around the world to integrate and establish multispectral workflows in their digitization and preservation programs. At the library, she works with conservators, curators and scholars to apply non-invasive optical technologies to support the preservation of the library's extensive and eclectic collections and expand the historical understanding of these materials. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our two speakers to develop more into this area. Thank you.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you so much, Fenella, for that nice introduction. I think my work here is done. I think you have summed it all up very nicely. We have people in the audience. Thank you so much for coming. We have people on Zoom. What they don't know is that you had to fight through the snow to get here today. So it's snowing in Washington, D.C. It's not snowing in other places where people are watching from, like San Antonio, Texas, and Eugene, Oregon, and New York, I think it is. But anyway, so thanks. Really, I appreciate all of you coming out today. It means a lot to both Megan and I. As an art historian, it's always a rare treat. I'm going to get these slides going here. Oops, uh-oh. Oh, no, I guess I'm not going to get the slides going. Technical support. Thank you. As an art historian, it's always a rare treat to be able to pull back the curtain, as Fenella had alluded to, on an object and explore what went into that object's creation. So I'm very grateful to the Library of Congress and to the Preservation Research and Testing Division for the opportunity to explore and present on material aspects of the manuscript map of the Dartmoor River region with preservation scientist Megan Hill. I was first introduced to the magical, the magic of technical analysis and material studies as a graduate student. And as a graduate student, I actually had a fellowship with the KISLAC where we were doing a little bit of testing. I'm sorry. Where we conducted some neutron activation analysis testing on ceramic objects. And with the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, we undertook X-ray and zero radiography, as well as, we were looking at objects under UV light. And I think what these techniques revealed for me was that there's a lot of information you can't get, obviously, with the naked eye. And so through these techniques and these technologies, you can learn about the technical construction, the processes, and also you can learn a lot about modern interventions on works on paper as well as three-dimensional objects. When I first came across this map in 2015, I was interested in why the map was made, but I was also curious about the map's material aspects. So its pigments, its inks, its paper, its watermarks, and its adhesives. What we're looking at in this map, at least in the top portion, is a remote region in today's Colombia, an area that even today is considered the frontier of the frontier. And this led me to wonder if the materials that were used in creating this map, the pigments, the inks, the paper, and the adhesives, might have been sourced from local materials. Were they mined locally? Were they pulled from local plants? Or are they things that somehow managed to make it to this remote frontier? So that was one of the questions that was sort of driving our investigation. Talking to Anthony Mullen of the Geography and Map Division, who we were lucky to have with us today, I learned about the PRTD and submitted a proposal to carry out analysis of this map. And this very fortunately led to collaboration with Megan Hill, Tana Villafana, and Hadley Johnson in 2022. So Megan is going to present the scientific and technical information, what you've really all come here to see, all the good new hot off the press information. And then before that, just to set that up, I am going to introduce the map and provide a little bit of historical background for everyone. So I think we should start with a visual unpacking of the map, just so that we're all looking at the same thing, I guess. So I think, this is maybe obvious, but just to point it out, this is a large document. It is created by adhering 8 folios together, and you can see the seams in the map portion of the top. So it ends up being, it's about the size of a writing desk surface. We have the document broken up into 2 sections. So we've got the map in the top portion. We have the pretty extensive, unusually extensive, I should say, legend in the bottom portion of the map. So we're going to dive into the map itself here. So in the map portion itself, well, here, let's see here. I think I'm going to point this out really quickly, and I've enlarged this, but the date at the bottom basically tells us that on this date, December 19th, 1764, in the Spanish colonial town of Cali, which is pretty tiny even then. Now it's actually a big city. There were 3 witnesses whose signatures are sort of hidden behind my enlarged date there, and they approved the map or witnessed the map, and so we have people already tied, to this map and to this region. At the time that this map was created, Colombia formed part of New Granada, which was one of 4 viceroyalties governed by Spain. So if we focus on the map itself, we're looking at this aerial view. And what's kind of cool and fun about this map is that it's color-coded. So it's topographically color-coded, where the blue on the top and the bottom represents these higher, more mountainous elevations, kind of the mountaintops. And then the green and the kind of green, the browns, some yellows in the middle denote these lower elevations where you have, that are much more tropical and densely sort of jungly and stuff like that. And then coursing across the map itself from left to right, we have the Dagua River. That's the central feature on this map. And it is flowing from left to right into the Pacific Ocean. And what you, okay, let me just point out this too. So if you zoom into the map, you have the white that indicates the rivers and the tributaries, and then those really thin black lines. Can you see those where you are? Okay. Those are roads. There aren't that many of them. And the ones that were built, the documents constantly talk about how they're washed away and they're nothing more than footpaths. But we do have roads. And then also on this map, we have a scattering of structures, not a lot, but a couple, and they're kind of concentrated in the middle of the map. And the other thing that you probably noticed by now, let's see here, go here, is that the map is oriented 180 degrees sort of to what we're used to looking at. So here you have east on the left, and then you've got west on the right, and the Pacific Ocean then correspondingly is found on the right-hand side. The area that's depicted on the map covers a vast expanse of roughly 1,000 kilometers, and yet there are no towns on this map. There are no town centers, none of those gridded town centers that the Spanish imposed. There's not a single church, which is really, really unusual, nor do we have any real evidence of Spanish colonial presence. And so this makes this map very, very unusual when compared to other maps created at this time and before of the Spanish Empire. The few glosses on the map we see here, and this is denoting the sort of the exit of the Dagua River into the Pacific Ocean, into the port of Buenaventura. Buenaventura today is kind of it's a bustling port, probably kind of infamous for lots of contraband going in and out of there. And then so you got Dagua River, the port, and then obviously the Pacific Ocean there as well. So the area that the map depicts falls within the southwestern region of Colombia. This is an area today known as the Pacific Lowlands or the Greater Chocó. It is very, very wet. It is very, very tropical. It is very, very warm. I think it's very great for biodiversity, but not so great for human habitation. It's kind of considered a hardship post. And the Europeans who were having to live there did nothing but complain in the 18th century about how horrible it was. Today, less than 5% of Colombia's population inhabits this region, but this area remained of interest to the Spanish and others because it was an area very rich in alluvial mines and gold. So that was mined from the rivers. Okay, so now we'll take a look at this. We'll kind of shift to the legend a little bit and sort of point out what we have there. In the legend, we have names of places. One of the most populated sites on the map is that of Sombrerillo, which I've circled here. And Sombrerillo is interesting because it was an outpost for free Africans and escaped enslaved laborers. So it's kind of this hub of escape, this kind of free zone in this frontier. This map, then, is important because it's one of the earliest detailed depictions that we have of this remote frontier. If you look at printed maps of the time, this Pacific Lowlands area is generally just a void. You don't get any information. So you really have to look at manuscript maps to get the detail of what would have filled those gaps. It's not that these places were empty. They just weren't documented on printed maps a lot of times. So it's important just for providing this detail, this early data about this region, but it also, this map, if we kind of dive into it, sheds light on a very unique colonial situation, and that was geographic, social, and economic factors that led to the social mobility of a generally restricted group of people, Africans and their descendants. So, with that background behind us, we'll talk a little bit about the archival research. And so one of the things that I hoped to find when I went to Colombia to work in the archives, and this is a few years after I had seen and studied the map. So it was kind of, one thing I should probably just interject here is that the map was acquired by the library in 2000. It did not come with associated documents, and that may seem standard, but I'll explain in just a second why that's not so standard. So what I was hoping to find in the Columbian archives were names of people and places that were mentioned on this map, in part just to sort of, verify is something, does it correlate, with other documents, or does it sort of exist in isolation? So what I learned was that maps in Columbian archives and other archives weren't created to exist by themselves. They're often accompanied by other documents. Sometimes, there would be a huge case file with hundreds of folios that give details about the place, the people, the events, concerns of that particular region. And then the map is usually kind of filed with those documents. In some rare instances, the case file will contain a single document that will explain the map, point to the map, tell you why it was made, who made it, what they hoped in making the map. But we don't have that with the Library of Congress Dogwell River map because, as I'd mentioned, it came in independently. And so I suspect that there are documents out there that explain it. I have yet to find them. So if any of you are out in the archives and find this document, please do let me know. Okay. But what I did find in the archives were documents that had information on the 3 witnesses whose signatures are on the lower right-hand corner of the map. And I also found information on the very interesting site of Sombrerillo. Archival documents in Cali, Colombia from 1739 describe Sombrerillo as hedonistic, a place where residents did not participate in mass, drank to excess, committed robberies and attacks, and lived scandalously. This is actually the document where it says that. The map shows Sombrerillo completely surrounded by water, which is interesting and handy because this kind of moat-like feature served as a form of defense, given that most of Sombrerillo's residents were of African descent and had escaped the bonds of enslavement. In documents, Sombrerillo is discussed as an informal settlement of great ethnic diversity that included Blacks, Indians, mulattoes, mestizos, and whites. And many of those living in Sombrerillo were vital to the trade and transport, I guess, I don't know if it's an industry exactly, but just to moving goods and people in and out of the region. So they're working as porters, they're working as canoers, and some of this travel happens on foot, on sometimes people carrying people on their backs, sometimes people carrying goods on their backs through the region, and other travel through this area happened on the very, very dangerous Dogwell River with these very expert, skilled bogas, they're called, or canoers. And this is an illustration from the 19th century, kind of maybe overly romanticizing it because it sounds like a really hellacious journey. Not all of the Dogwell was navigable. There was just a small portion of it that was. So most of the travel that happened in this region was kind of a combination of overland traffic and river traffic. The map itself includes a reference to the centrality of canoers in the region. So this is in another part of the map, but we have a representation of a tiny little canoe with somebody on the bow, somebody on the stern. And this is noteworthy because these are the only 2 figures noted anywhere on the map. So while the Dogwell River region map was probably created to support a land dispute regarding mines and agricultural areas, a close read, pulling from archival documents, reveals a lot about African resilience, entrepreneurship, and autonomy on this remote frontier. Okay, so now we have all of our vegetables out of the way, I guess, right? All the necessary elements. So with this historical context behind us, I'm going to return to the technical analysis and just mention that, actually go back here for one sec. Technical analysis of colonial Latin American works on paper, so like this map or other documents, have been underway for 3 decades, so that's not necessarily new. But the work that has been done to date has focused largely on 16th and 17th century maps and manuscripts from Mesoamerica, so from Mexico and Central America. Relatively little has been done on 18th century hand-painted manuscript maps like this one, which is precisely why the research that was undertaken by Megan and the PRTD is so important. This work contributes to our collective knowledge of materials, technologies, and global trade for peripheral areas of the Spanish Empire. So what do we learn from technical analysis? We learn about periodization. So do the materials that were used align with the work's alleged date, place of creation, etc.? Technical studies can also tell us about the raw materials that were used. They can talk about organic, inorganic, or a combination of both. They can talk about or illuminate the use of pre-contact versus post-contact methods and materials, or the combination of both. And they can even tell us about artist pigment preferences and the symbolism of materials themselves. So just to provide a couple of concrete examples before I hand this over to Megan, studies undertaken by the PRTD include research in 2016 on Frederick DeWitt's Atlas and World Map. And these are sort of interesting because the technical analysis sort of illuminated two different findings. So for the atlas itself, Stephanie Stillo, who led the research, found that the materials used were period appropriate. Conversely, on DeWitt's hand-colored world map, there was evidence of chrome yellow, cerulean blue, and cadmium, which signaled later 19th century interventions, on a late 17th century printed map. So that's pretty interesting too. Work in 2021 on the library's Codex Huejotzingo revealed that indigenous artists were using native paper made of amate and maguey at the same time that they were employing new non-native methods, like the use of a thick white preparatory layer and orange kaolinite as a pigment. So these are just two discoveries, right, that can come out of work when humanities scholars partner with preservation scientists. So it's pretty exciting. So, and with that, I am going to hand the microphone over to Megan, who will discuss the aims of our study on the Dagua River map, as well as the technologies that were employed and the discoveries that resulted.
Thanks, Juliet. I just want to say first, before starting, that working with the Conservation Department, the curatorial divisions, and researchers like Juliet is by far my most favorite part of my job. It introduces me to the wondrous collection items that I haven't seen before here at the library. They pose always nuanced questions about the life and the use of an object, and really kind of challenge me to figure out how to answer their research questions and support their work in the greater context of cultural heritage. So in the sub-basement of the Madison Building here at the library, we have PRTD's optical laboratory. We're fortunate to have access to an array of different imaging and spectroscopy equipment, all of which are non-invasive, so there's never any sampling, or even contact between the instrument and the object, which curators tend to appreciate. When we look at objects, we often start with multispectral imaging as our baseline technique. So we use narrowband LED panels that illuminate the object in 17 wavelengths that span the ultraviolet, the visible, and the infrared region. Though we can only see under visible, the camera can see quite a bit under UV and infrared. And so this technique kind of allows us to very quickly navigate a large portion of an object's surface to see what's similar, what's dissimilar, get a baseline understanding of the materials, and more efficiently inform our other point source analyses. So you can see here the color on the left, and then what we take with the camera on the right, and you can see how the different materials start to kind of respond differently throughout the different wavelengths, and this is how we start to interpret some of the differences in the materials that were used. So some of the other instruments that we use in our lab also involve illuminating an object in different types of light and essentially measuring what bounces back versus what's absorbed. So different types of light provide different information about the material composition of the object. X-rays provide elemental information. Ultraviolet provides electronic information, causing some materials to uniquely glow or fluoresce as if they're under a black light. Visible light provides information about the color and how it's seen to the human eye. And infrared measures molecular vibrations and can tell us information about things that are invisible, like coatings or binders that were added to pigments. So for this project, we focused mostly on fiber optic reflectance spectroscopy, which I will call FORS, and Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, which I will call FTIR. As an aside, because I'm sure this may come up as a question, at the end of the day, we decided that we didn't need to use X-ray fluorescence or XRF. The point of this project when looking at pigments was to focus on indigenous, locally sourced materials like indigo or cochineal, which XRF can't detect compared to FORS and FTIR. But you'll see that in terms of figuring out what the pigment palette was, FORS and FTIR alone were able to answer our questions. So that's why we kind of just stuck to those two techniques. So in answering Juliet's questions, we started by looking at the composition of the map's paper. We found that it's a rag-based paper as compared to wood pulp, and it has a gelatin sizing detected on the back of the map only, which suggests that it was surface-sized. So here we have a picture of the FORS and the FTIR spectra with markers for how we could detect the protein of the gelatin sizing. Using transmitted imaging, where we project the light from below through the object, we were able to find watermarks on 4 of the 8 sheets that the map's made out of. There's 2 designs. There is one in the paper that was used for the painted map, and there is another watermark found in the legend itself on the bottom. The imagery between the watermarks is thematically the same, as you can see, but contains very slightly different details. So each design you can see consists of an oval with a cross, a crown atop, adornments to the side, and then a circle below with either the initials CAB or GC, and then below that another circle with the initial I. So this could suggest that the top portion of the map and the bottom portion of the map were made in possibly 2 different locations and then joined together at a later time. We were able to find a watermark similar to the one found in the legend on a manuscript, a Hispanic folio that was dated 1759. So this certainly helped us corroborate the map's provenance. We didn't detect any comprehensive underdrawing across the map. There was no sort of rough sketch laid out before the cartographers put ink to paper. But we did find 2 small edits, and they were both on the left side of the map, and it was to the river names themselves. So you can see one example here and the other here. It appears that these edits were simply a change to the position of the words. It didn't necessarily allude to any change in the names themselves or anything like that. So when we take a look at the legend under infrared light, you can see that the ink becomes nearly transparent, and it reveals the ruled lines and margins that were laid out by the scribe before writing the legend. There's no observable edits that we could find in the text of the legend, and really this kind of indicates that the map may have been methodically planned. Between this ruling and the lack of the underdrawing, it kind of suggests that there may have been an earlier draft of the map that they're working from. So this image segues very nicely into identification of the ink itself. Iron Gall ink was used in the legend, in the river names, and in the bold letters found across the map. Iron Gall ink is easily identifiable by its transparency under infrared light. Other carbon-based inks, for comparison, like many historic printing inks, would remain bold and dark in infrared, so it's kind of a very good initial indication. Another technique that we can derive from the multispectral imaging is false color infrared. Iron Gall ink has a very unique red color response in this method, which you can see highlighted on the top left there in our samples, which compare Iron Gall ink's response to what the response of other carbon-based inks would be. As you can see on the map image to the right, the pigments also have very wild-looking responses in false color IR, but we used other techniques as a means to identify the pigments, which I'll get to in just a second. So as Juliet noted, the back of the map contains shorthand signatures, or rubrics, on the 4 middle pages. Each cluster contains the same 3 signatures, which match those that Juliet talked about on the front of the map from the witnesses. And these were also confirmed as Iron Gall ink. And then lastly, the most captivating part of the map, the pigments. Both FORS and FTIR confirmed the blue colorant, which was consistent across the entire map, is azurite. Azurite is a copper carbonate mineral commonly used as a pigment since antiquity. It was a popular alternative to using expensive lapis lazuli or ultramarine. FTIR identified peaks that were consistent with protein binding in the medium of the pigment, and so we believe that it was mixed with glare or egg whites when it was made. The only incongruity we found is the blue in this area here, which is on a seam on the left-hand side. There looks to be some disturbance, and it's possible that this area underwent a repair. The hue of the pigment is visibly lighter than the surrounding blue, and the paper itself appears to have been very carefully glued down. The signal of the pigment was overwhelmed by the characteristics of the paper, but we were able to identify the presence of a clay filler, whereas the paper and the rest of the map do not contain a clay filler. So I do want to note at the seams in general, one of Juliet's initial research questions was to look at the adhesive that was used to put the map together. Due to the size and the fragility of the map, we weren't able to safely kind of maneuver our instrumentation to get a good reading of the adhesives, unfortunately. But as our technology, as we get some accessories, and hopefully with a tripod with a longer arm, this is something that we can revisit in the future. So moving on to the green pigment, we identified this as verdigris. Verdigris is a copper acetate that has also been used since antiquity. It was very popular for its vibrancy, as you can see here. Verdigris is a green pigment in its own right, so it's not a mixture of blue and yellow. The binding medium lacks the protein-based peaks that we found in the azurite, which suggests that it was mixed with gum arabic. Usually, visually, as you can kind of see, the green, the hue of the green kind of varies in different places. And so we did take a look to make sure that everything was verdigris. It seemed pretty consistent, and when we took a closer look, it seemed like these variabilities were where the green was applied over a yellow or over a brown or over a blue. And so it was kind of a layering aspect instead of a mixture of the pigment itself. At the very right, on the little ship, we have a couple spots of red, which we identified as vermilion, another pigment commonly used since antiquity, which was made from grinding the mineral cinnabar. Again, the FTIR spectra lacked protein peaks, so we believe that this was probably mixed with gum arabic as a binding medium. Looking at the yellows and browns, they were generally featureless, and thus we couldn't conclusively identify what they were. But yellow organic dyes are notoriously difficult to identify non-invasively with spectroscopy techniques because their features both overlap themselves and overlap with the substrate, making the source of them very difficult to determine. There were slight indications of an iron oxide-based pigment, which could suggest an ochre. So just in summary, to recap all of that, the map's watermarks and rag paper are consistent with folios in circulation in the Spanish Americas at this time. The iron gall ink and the pigments, which we identified as azurite, verdigris, and vermilion, are also consistent with inks and pigments used in Spanish colonial periods. This data kind of confirms the map as a product of the 18th century. The use of possibly imported mineral pigments suggests that while this map was used and made in a place that was off the beaten path, such pigments were available due to global trade. The relative absence of an underdrawing, together with the carefully gridded lines, suggests that the map may have been planned out ahead of time and followed the model of an earlier draft. More studies on 18th century manuscript maps from Spanish America can, of course, help further contextualize this. So before I hand back off to Juliet, I just want to say that the collaboration of science and scholarship is really paramount to what we do in PRTD, and the unique expertise that researchers like Juliet and the curators bring to the conversation enable us to explore such a wealth of information about our collections, and I'm just really fortunate that Juliet came to work with us.
Just to conclude. Thank you, Megan. Yeah, and again, I wanted to get up here just to say one last thank you to the Library of Congress and to the PRTD for making this possible, for Megan and her team and all of their great work. And just to emphasize this final point that Megan had made, that with more studies on 18th century manuscript maps, we'll be able to contextualize these finds. Right now, they mean something, but I think they'll mean a lot more when we get a better sense of what that landscape looks like for the 18th century in the Spanish Americas, in the Andes, in South America, as well as in Mesoamerica, Mexico. And just a final plug for my book. If you'd like to know more about this map or about Megan's study, or Megan and her team's study, I will point you to my new book, The History of a Periphery, Spanish Colonial Cartography from Colombia's Pacific Lowlands, published by University of Texas Press. And this is actually hot off the press. It just came out January. So I believe there's still lots of copies available, but you can help me with that. So anyway, thank you again so much to all of those who made this research and this talk possible. Okay. Let me turn it back over to Fenella.
So huge thank you to both of our speakers. I'm going to ask them both to come back up, and I will be wandering around with a microphone so that if you have any questions, then also those of you who have joined us online will be able to hear the questions and the answers. So Juliet, Megan, please come back. And do you have any questions from the audience?
I actually have a couple questions. Is this on? So one was about, I was a little bit curious about the acquisition process of this document. Who was the vendor? How was it identified? And the second question was if it was common for colonial maps to be turned 180 degrees like this one, which I have never ever seen that before.
We are very lucky. We are very lucky to have in our audience with us today Anthony Mullen, who was responsible for bringing the map into the collection. Do you want to answer the first part of that question? Or the second?
I didn't hear the first part.
So, who was vendor? How was it identified?
Well, actually, I don't know the background to that because it came to the acquisition, notice the acquisitions officer at the time. And many times with maps, there's actually very little provenance. Even if we acquire it through a dealer, we know the dealer, but we often don't know much more about it than that. And unfortunately, it's not like with other types of materials where there's much more provenance. So I at this point, partly because this is some time ago, I don't really remember all of those things. But the orientations of maps, we always think that a map is oriented. Can you hear me? Okay. Oh. We always think of, nowadays when we look at a map, the map is most times oriented with north at the top. It wasn't that way before. And so it could be east or south, it could be totally turned around. So that's why you have the orientation with the Pacific. In other words, if we look at the Dagua River map, when we look at it, it looks as though the Pacific is where the Atlantic Ocean should be, right? But that's not the case.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just gonna tack on a little answer to that too. But so orientation, I think like what I've found is it's directed by the major feature, and so it's usually following the river. And so if the river flows left to right, then that's how the map is oriented a lot of the times. Again, I haven't looked at I haven't looked at as many maps as Anthony, but like just in this area, that's what I've been finding. And then only because I did look into the provenance years ago, what I recall was that I think it was acquired, it was purchased through the Philadelphia Print company, something like that. I looked them up. They have changed ownership. And so the person was, I think I wrote a few times. The first time they were pretty evasive because I was asking if there had been documents that were associated with the map, if they had any information on that. And so the answer was kind of no answer. And then when I went back to ask again, the answer was that they had changed ownership. And so the new person didn't have any information on the previous. Yeah, but I'm sure there's a document out there somewhere that, went with this map. So yeah, thanks for the question.
And just to add, the work that Megan and other staff have done, to Anthony's point, is actually trying to get back into some of that provenance and add that information back into the picture. I see it.
Hi. I actually was wondering if you might be willing to talk a little bit about, Juliet, your introduction to incorporating material science into your research, and kind of how did you come to the library to use this, and what led you to come to utilize these techniques. I think it's definitely an underutilized point of research for humanities in particular. So if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I think too, just as an art historian, where we need to know how these things are constructed. We need to know what they're made of. It's crazy to me that more people don't tap into this. However, you have to have an object that is held by an institution with technology and experts, and that doesn't always happen. And so, like I guess the whirlwind tour of how I was first introduced to material analysis. At the Institute of Fine Arts, we had a class at the Hispanic Society in New York, and I don't remember, they must have had an X-ray machine there, and so we were able to X-ray the 17th century paintings that we were working on. It was I'm not gonna, I won't remember is it Giuseppe de Ribera, I think, that I had worked on. But it was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. This is a completely different painting. And you see all the lead white, and you see like how the brush moved around the canvas. And it was like, oh, this is like a revelation. And so I think just with that little introduction, it was like, okay, like what else can we do? And then I ended up working on 1,500-year-old ceramic objects. And so UV light became really important to look at restorations and sort of areas of modern intervention. But then with Emily Kaplan at the Smithsonian, at National Museum of the American Indian, we did a bigger study on X-rays of these moche vessels to look at the technical construction of them. And then we also, I think they had a zero radiography machine, so that gave us even more information. So I think it's just that, and then in getting introduced to this map, it was like, oh my gosh, this is I suspect that the library has the technology and the experts to help us get more information about this. And then talking to Anthony, I was led to Fenella, and then led to Megan and her colleagues. And it just, I think the possibilities are endless. right? As long as we have the maps and the technologies and the people all in the same place. So is that long? Is that kind of, yeah, but it's amazing that it's not used more. But I think the reason for that is just the stars aligning a little bit with the object being in the right place with the right people.
Just going to take some online questions.
Yeah, this is a question for Megan. Did you observe the morphology of the azurite under the polarized light microscopy in order to differentiate it with a blue vertitor?
So we didn't do polarized microscopy. The map is a little bit too big to fit under our microscope. So the way in which we identified the azurite was primarily with FORS, fiber optic reflectance spectroscopy. Azurite has very significant peaks, little triplet peaks in the IR that you can identify it with very pretty easily in comparison to other similar pigments. So that was how we identified the azurite. And then FTIR confirmed as well.
Lynn, just 1 second.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Mhm.
Yeah. I also have a question about the azurite. Yeah, I was just wondering if you had any hypothesis why it was bound in protein, but everything else was in gum, Arabic? I mean, that seemed kind of unusual to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in some of other documents we've looked at, pigments can respond differently with different binders. If it's an unusual binder, we found instances where it's mixed with something unique in an effort to look different, right? So we found reds before that were made to look kind of more lustrous, to look like vermilion, even though they weren't vermilion. So it could be a case of that. Not really 100% sure.
I actually had another question. I think for Julianne, maybe for Anthony too. Was it very common to document rivers in maps and cartography at this time?
I've been focusing on the Pacific lowlands, and it's just nothing but river. Just everything is riparian. That's how people got around. And so I think the other thing in this area is you have rivers that are essentially providing an Atlantic Pacific passage. Like before the Panama Canal, it wasn't perfect. It took a lot longer. It was a little treacherous, and then there was a kind of land bridge in there that you had to connect. So rivers were major routes of travel, but I think they also were places where a lot of the indigenous inhabitants had lived originally, and so there's a lot of contested land issues. So if you're working on maps from Santa Fe to Bogota, you're probably not finding the rivers there. Not that there aren't, but they're not. The maps aren't going to focus on the rivers. But in the area of Colombia where I have focused, it's all maps that are anchored around rivers. Yeah. That's interesting.
So if we're talking about any time before the 19th century, and I'm being vague about that, it could be before 1850, rivers were major arteries throughout the world, because if you think about what sort of transportation there was, modes of transportation, yes, there could be a cart road or a wagon road, but oftentimes the river or stream or a large stream was the most effective way to carry produce or goods or people. So it's a very good question, and yes, because I'm often reminding myself when I'm looking at maps why rivers are so important. So
I'm just doing a quick sprint to the other side of the room. That's quite all right.
My question's for Megan. The analysis you did, is this a very time intensive, or is this like a day of looking at a map, or is it a week long or a month long to come to your conclusions?
The data capture itself is, of course, a lot quicker than the interpretation. When we worked on this map, we did everything in one full day. We could have taken more time, but it's with our collections, we try to give them back to the curatorial divisions and cut down on the handling and get what we can do. We have a pretty streamlined workflow between a lot of our different instruments, so we are able to kind of capture a lot of information in a short amount of time. The interpretation then probably takes a couple weeks maybe to write up. So we kind of each look at the techniques individually and what we find with them, and then kind of have a meeting together to kind of talk about, like, okay, I saw this with the imaging, I saw this with the fours, does this make sense together, or are there discrepancies that we have to look at again? And of course, one of the most important things too is making sure that we're keeping the researchers and the curators in the discussion with us as well, because we can't be experts on, a map like this, but, talking to someone from GNM, we can be like, hey, we found this, and, what does this tell us? And, sometimes they get super excited about something that I thought was, a minor detail and whatever. But yeah, I would say initially the data collection, a day, maybe 2 days, and then the interpretation a couple weeks.
Do we have any other questions from the audience?
Just really quickly, all of these projects, right, always have something that sort of like pops out of the closet and surprises you in one way or another. Was there anything that sort of surprised you about this analysis? Was there anything that you particularly struggled with? Was there anything sort of fun or?
I love working with geography and maps because things are not, they have a very different definition of small there. So in terms of difficulties, for sure, like this is a very large map. So like imaging it took a long time because we had to image it in so many sections. So of course, that's an issue. But overall, I mean, really, this object is so beautiful, right? So just, I think finding the watermarks in particular and kind of the information that kind of gave us was one of the more interesting things. I know we were kind of disappointed that we didn't find indigo or cochineal or more like locally sourced things, but what we found is still okay for the time period, right? So, it really talks about trade routes and, how they're bringing things over from Spain and things like that, so.
And maybe to add on to that, this area, well, I mean, again, it was made in Cali, so that's kind of, it's a hub, it's still a remote hub, but it's maybe things are getting there, somehow. So, yeah, no, exactly.
Thank you for this, which was fascinating to me. I have a question about if you have a way to understand at all the value of the map then, perhaps more than now. I mean, now it obviously is infinitely precious, but the economic value of the map at the time that it was made, the way in which it was used, was it valued as an object of beauty? Was it valued in a particular way for the information that it carried, for its role in a colonial scene of exchange? Do you have a sense of its value? Does economics come into your discussion, your analysis at all?
Economics does, but not of the maps that I've been studying. But I'll first just kind of restate something that I've touched upon in the talk, which is this is a really unusual map. It's a really spectacular map, and I've spent time looking at all of the hand-drawn, manuscript watercolor maps in Columbia's collection. There are 2 other maps that are slightly bigger, not as dramatically spectacular in terms of coloring, but still the coloring is really unusual. Usually you just get a single sheet of paper, pen and ink kind of a thing, or maybe 2, pen and ink. So just the nature of the painterly qualities of this map is really unusual. I mean, I am suspecting, and I write about this in the book, that these maps were created to support arguments. And so they're not created as works of art, but I think the more beautiful they are, probably the better they support whoever's argument. So in this case, I found documents that were dated a year prior to the map and dealt with a land dispute about mines in this area and agricultural areas, kind of in the center of the map. I would love to know like what it cost to commission this map, because I don't think the person who commissioned it painted it himself. I mean, it's possible, but you know, like, is there a market for this? Because they're certainly from Colombia, and I think, you know, Peru's got its own kind of systems of maps in the 18th century that are similar, but they're created to support an argument that is maybe regional. Some of it ends up going to the Spanish crown in Madrid, but it's about infrastructure. Nobody's got any roads. Nobody's got any, there's no defensive sites. And, you know, so they're trying to show and kind of exaggerate the space to show that they need more resources. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I don't know, something like this, right, where you've got 8 sheets of paper, where did they store that? Did they fold it up? You know, did they just have a vault with all the court cases that had maps to support it? I don't know, but it's a really good question, and it would be really interesting to know the commercial side of the maps. You know, was there one guy that was like the go-to map guy for river stuff? I don't know, but it is a good question. I've been thinking about it. I don't have an answer.
Sorry, my last 2 questions. I'm sorry, I'm asking so many questions. Did you find that Sombrerillo still exists, the town, or the little? Yeah, the little town?
Sombrerillo is mentioned in 19th century travel accounts. Is that right? No, it's not actually mentioned. No, I think the last Las Juntas is, which is nearby. Sombrerillo, like the last document I found that mentioned it was 1780. And so the earliest mention I found of it was 1739, which to me was remarkable, because it's like, here you have this community of escaped African enslaved people, free Africans, like this multi-ethnic grouping, which the Spanish crown did not ever want to happen, you know, in a single town, who controlled, you know, a lot of stuff, trade and transport in the area. But it disappears, and there's no like big statement about like it was you know, it was that they intentionally destroyed it. I think the geography, like just being, you know, if you got the river rising and falling, being a little island, to me just suggests it can't live forever. But I did find it in a later map, not called Sombrerillo. It's called, I can't remember. It's in the book. But the same geographical feature along the Dagua, same kind of location where you get this island-like thing. I can't remember the name of it. I'm not gonna be able to remember it. But so it looks like it changed names at some point, and then did it maybe totally disappear? I don't know. But again, these are all things I've been wrestling with.
So we just have the last question over here.
I guess.
So I have a question about the handwriting. Have you done any paleographic research on the handwriting, and have you found that handwriting on any other maps?
No, I haven't. I guess like with the handwriting, usually it's a scribe, it's a notary who's doing a lot of the writing in the documents. So the signatures, you know, are going to correspond with like the commissioner or whatever. But no, I haven't. And I think I thought about that initially, and I wasn't finding connections, so I gave it up. But it would be interesting, right? Like, is there someone who paints these maps and then someone who writes the legends? It's entirely possible.
I know there are lots of questions, but we're at time. So I'd just like to, firstly, I'm sure our folks will stay around if you have some more questions. So nab them before they get to the door. Huge thanks to all of our technical folks, and a huge thank you to our sign language people, very much appreciated. Could you please join me again in giving our two presenters a huge round of thank yous.